welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe, with me, Tom Sherrington, and Emma Turner, who looks like you're in a fancy hotel room.
I am in a slightly fancy hotel room, but I don't normally record, as I was just saying off air, with a bath and a sink-in shot. So it's a slightly different view for anybody who's watching the YouTube version. And it's also very cold, so I'm not being super formal, but I have to have my jacket on for this one. Although I do feel suitably dressed because we are addressing one of the superstars and, biggest names in education. So I thought potentially I might dress for the occasion as well. So.
Well, that's very appropriate. We have with us Professor Dan Willingham. Welcome, Dan. Great to have you on the podcast.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, you're a person I reference often. In fact, I've even given a talk at a conference where you were sitting in the audience, which was quite extraordinary. And now your picture would have came up, and that must be quite a strange feeling when that happens. But tell people who may be not sure kind of where you work and what you're up to, kind of what your current work is and what you're involved in at the moment.
Sure. So I'm, for folks who don't know me, I'm a cognitive psychologist by training, who for the first 10 or 15 years of my career did basic scientific research in memory, and got interested in education sort of mid-career, and for the last 20 years or so have tried to think about ways that what psychologists know about how thinking operates can help teachers in the classroom. And most recently, what I've been interested in is critical thinking.
Okay, that's so interesting. And I think you've said it, you talk about it in your books, this sort of idea that you've told the story about going to a teacher conference and being surprised at how little people knew about learning, and therefore sort of writing that your sort of legendary book, Why Don't Students Like School, is sort of addressed sort of to teachers in a sense. But what's your sense now? Do you meet teachers now, and do you think we're making any progress in that area?
I certainly meet more teachers today who know about learning science than I did when I first started. As you said, I mean, that teacher conference, I was invited to speak at that really by accident. It was because the person who was running it lives in my hometown in Virginia, and is actually head of a nonprofit. And he knew me, and he was very interested in cognitive psychology. I'm talking about him personally. Lots of your listeners will know this was E.D. Hirsch, who approached me about this. He had called me when he was working on his book, which came out, I guess, in 1996, "The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them." And Nick Gibb actually just revealed to me. He may have talked about it previously, but he didn't reveal it just to me. I read about it. So I make it sound like Nick and I were down in the pub, and he was regaling me with stories. It wasn't like that at all. But I just learned that Nick Gibb was hugely influenced by The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them. And when Don Hirsch was writing that, he approached the psychology department sort of broadly and said, "Is there anybody here who knows anything about cognition? Because I'm very interested in cognitive psychology." And so I had several conversations with Don at that time. I guess that would have been 1995. And that was great fun. And then I sort of forgot about it for 5 years or so. And then he approached me years later, I guess in 2000 or 2001, and asked me if I would speak at this conference for the Core Knowledge Foundation, and with about 500 teachers in attendance. And I rashly said, "Sure, I'll be glad to talk to a bunch of teachers," knowing nothing at all about classrooms. And it was only when I had to actually prepare the talk that I realized how desperately frightened I was and how ill prepared I felt. But yeah, as you say, that was really career changing for me, because I would, very much to my surprise, the reason I was so frightened was I felt, what can I possibly tell teachers about learning that they don't already know? And so I just sort of picked out some stuff from the kind of introductory course that I had already been teaching for many years, or the first course in learning and thinking that you would take if you're a university student. That was the one I taught. And so the fact that teachers didn't already know that content was astonishing to me. But the teachers who were there were very warm and very, interested in what I had to say. And so that was what convinced me to sort of change fields or change the focus of my work at the least. But I do think it's quite different today. I mean, for goodness sake, if you go into, if I gave that talk at any research ed conference, I would be met with, well, yeah, thanks, I guess, but we know all this. Like, what else have you got, right? And so I think there are many, many more educators who are much more knowledgeable about what cognitive psychology has to offer.
I think it's interesting though, because there's so many sort of truths, core truths in why don't students like school. I was going to hold it up actually on the camera that people listening won't see it, but it's a classic book and it's now in its second edition. And you're famous for the classic quote, "Memory is the residue of thought," and that very concept. And in that book, I'll read this bit out because it's for me a bit of implications for the classroom. And there's a chapter which is called "Why do students forget everything I say and remember everything that's on television, or the other way around?" And it's actually it's very insightful because when you read it, you think, oh, it's not because of my students have these deficits as individuals. It's because they have a human brain and it's kind of predictable. And this bit you say, "This sentence may represent the most general and useful idea that cognitive psychology can offer teachers, and that's review each lesson plan in terms of what the student is likely to think about." And you think that sounds so obvious, but yeah, translating that into practice so that every student is thinking about the material seems to be quite a challenge. I mean, that phrase, is that something you still feel?
Absolutely. And it's certainly in my own teaching in higher ed. I try to remember that all the time, but I mean, I think it's so easy, isn't it, to when you're planning a lesson, to believe that it'll go the way you hope it will go, right? Like, you sort of know what you want to happen. And so you sort of let yourself think that's what's going to happen. And yeah, that's the ugly truth is that they don't remember what you hope they will remember. They don't even remember what they hope they're going to remember. They remember what they think about, and that's actually, what you think about moment to moment is not very easy to control.
It's interesting when you ask teachers. I mean, Emma, you might come in on this, but in the training, I sort of use a model, which is like a sort of brain image version of your block diagram of the memory model, and we talk about what are some of the reasons why students might not learn something when you've tried to explain it to them, and often teachers will say quite early on, they'll talk about emotional barriers. Sometimes they'll go down into sort of trauma, but mainly they'll just talk about emotional baggage. And the second thing is they'll talk about if it's not something they're interested in, they won't focus their attention. So they have the sense that if they were more interested, they would more like to learn it, or if they didn't have emotional issues. So what do you think about that? What would you say to a teacher who was saying that's their sense of the class being a sort of room full of emotional beings who they can't really focus, like it's almost out of their control?
I guess the first thing I would ask to know more about the emotional issues that they're referring to. What exactly does that look like? Tom, can you answer for them since they're not here?
Yeah, I mean, it would be the sort of thing where someone has, I don't know, like it could be any number of issues that they have in their home life, of family problems, that it just so they come into school where their thoughts are about, having their parents have been shouting at each other, or they've had to look after a small child because that kind of they come from a deprived family and that's the challenge. All those sorts of quite serious issues, social,
Sure.
emotional. And so they're saying the reason why they're not learning isn't a kind of technical cognitive thing. They perceive it as mainly an emotional thing.
Yeah.
And I always try to connect that to them and say, well, you're the teacher. You're not a psychologist or a counselor. You're a teacher. But I mean, what's your view of that? How does that affect learning? Those sorts of
Oh,
issues.
well, I mean, it absolutely does. And I mean, I think all of us have the same sort of issues in that we can identify with those issues in smaller ways. I mean, certainly I live a life where I have fewer troubles than, you know, some students do of the sort that you're describing. I don't show up at class hungry. I don't, you know, show up at class worried about my parents having had a big fight or that sort of thing. But you know, I have emotional ups and downs just like everyone. And you know, I have bad days where things just don't, you know, things are not, I'm not myself and things aren't going well. And I think every teacher has it too. But I'm an adult, right? And so I'm much better at regulating that and knowing, you know, I have a richer set of strategies for coping with that. So I think that that concern that teachers are bringing is very valid. But the other thing I would ask is, you know, how consistent is that when we say, what are the reasons that your children aren't learning? You know, I kind of mean like, yeah, of course that happens, but you know, is that like the main obstacle for a given child, or is it something that happens? And for some children, it, you know, it can happen fairly frequently, but it makes it sound a little bit like this child's, you know, this child has a difficult home life, and so there's nothing they can do about it, and there's nothing I can do about it, right?
Mm.
There's this obstacle that's no one's fault, but nevertheless, it's an obstacle that's very hard to know how to get around. And I expect and hope that nobody means that, you know, even when this issue speaks to the value of a classroom being serene, being predictable, being orderly, so that the child feels like, even if I'm coming from a home life that is chaotic and very difficult to manage, I kind of know what the rules are here. And I know that, you know, things are reliable here. I know I have positive regard from this teacher. They believe in me, they want the best for me. And so, you know, to the extent that we can, we're minimizing the role that those emotional blocks are going to play. All of this is in the context you mentioned just briefly. You're not a counselor, you're a teacher, and I'm very sympathetic to that. You know, all of this is not sort of in the mindset of, and I'm addressing in some direct way this student's distress. No, I'm setting up an environment and a relationship with this child that is very human and is going to make them feel as comfortable and productive as possible. But I'm not a counselor. That's not my training. And it would be a bad idea indeed for me to try to fulfill the role of a different profession.
Yeah, that makes sense. Emma,
When I,
what's your sense of it?
yeah, I was just thinking, because I was working with some early career teachers the other day, well, in actually initial teacher training colleagues, and we were talking about kind of three elements that you need to be aware of for really kind of effective instruction and running the classroom. And we were talking about understanding the kind of the cognitive element of your teaching and making that really precise and having a deep knowledge of how that works and setting up all the systems and structures to allow that to proceed as unencumbered as it can in a classroom of 30 children, but then also recognizing that there's the understanding of the behaviors that will affect that and the emotional aspects of the children, and that understanding those three things are three separate elements, and saying I can't action any of the cognitive actions because of the behavior or the
Yeah.
emotion doesn't negate the need to understand how learning happens, should the behaviors and should the emotions be all in alignment and beautifully aligned, like some kind of a constellation. But what we can't say is we don't need to understand how learning happens or how the cognition happens, because I've got children who have got emotional barriers or behavioral barriers. So we kind of drew it out into those three elements, and then looked at who's the right person to deal with. Like you were saying, is it a counsellor? Is it a qualified pastoral support worker to work with the kind of emotional, social part of it? The behavioural part of it, again, with your pastoral and behavioural team. But as the class teacher, you still need to have a really sound understanding and grounding of the cognition element about how learning happens. And I think the three can sometimes get a bit muddled and a bit muddied for some colleagues, which is potentially why you were saying what you were saying, Tom, about I can't do it because, or working with colleagues who.
So do you think, I mean, I mean, there's so many things as we go around this diagram. I mean, one of the other things you talk about is the power of. I'm so interested in. We could talk about so many questions, but the way that learning happens, the power of. Let's say the power of stories, and you do this brilliant thing in your Wine and Students Like School about narratives and having this sort of maybe looking for areas of conflict and the kind of aspects of a narrative, characters, a sort of a narrative arc. And
Mhm.
for me, I've always found that links nicely to this idea that you've talked about understanding is remembering in disguise, and the power of explaining. So if a child can run through the narrative of explaining something, that means they understand it. So I mean, could you unpack that a little bit for us in terms of how teachers need to deliver material? Is it better to tell whole stories and get children to relate that back, or how does that manifest itself as in a classroom?
I think the most powerful aspect of narrative is that it's a very natural vehicle for causality. And causality is very, very powerful indeed. That causality is, humans are keenly interested in causality. We're interested in causality because we're interested in being able to predict our environment. We want to know how things work if we can, so
Mm,
that we can be effective in the world. And it's easy to create a little evolutionary story that is probably trivial, but helps me because it's a story, right?
mm,
About why causality would be so powerful, that if you know how things work in your environment, they're more predictable. And causality is what really makes things predictable. So this is why in Why Don't Students Like School and elsewhere, I've emphasized, I think one of the best ways I've observed in classrooms to generate student interest is to motivate questions, to raise questions, to invest a significant amount of your effort and a non-trivial amount of student time, classroom time, into motivating questions and the content that you want students to understand is the answer to that question. Very often, the way I put it in that book, I think, is very often the questions are second nature to us. We know the questions, and so we're very excited to tell students about the answers. But the students don't even know what the question is. And having someone tell you the answer to a question when you don't know the question is not interesting at all. So most of my lessons, I typically teach 75-minute classes, and usually about the first 10 minutes, 15 minutes has very little to do with the content of the remaining hour. It's all about getting students to understand and appreciate why people were interested in this question in the first place. And that's the part, by the way, where I will frequently try to draw on aspects of their life that I think, things they can readily identify with. Because much of the content that I have to teach, like, it's not that relatable. If you're talking about the area CA1 of the hippocampus, like they've never thought about that before. They don't care, right? There's no reason for it. And so you have to set up, here's why researchers found that particular part of the brain especially exciting and interesting. That takes time to get into.
Dan,
so
how do you, sorry, this, when I work with teachers, one of the things they kind of know that they want to spend on time unpacking things and talking about things and framing it in a narrative. but they're trying to balance that with this pressure to cover content, to get through the things, and finding that time to sit with the really key parts and get to grips with it. What advice would you give to teachers who are feeling that pressure that I've just got to get through the content, when we know that actually sitting with it and going deeper and constructing those narratives is actually long term much more beneficial and leads to that sort of deeper understanding?
I would say to a teacher, it sounds like you've articulated the choice in front of you quite well, that you cannot do what you want to do. You want breadth and you want depth, and you know that you can't have both. And so you need to make a choice. And it sounds like to this point, your choice has typically been breadth and you're dissatisfied. Why don't you try depth for a few times and see what you think? And you can always go back, right? Like as I said, like you're very clear on the choice that's in front of you, and it's just, it's ticking you off. It's irritating you. You don't want to have to make that choice, but you kind of know you do. So make sure it's really fully informed and that you've explored both options.
So it's about combining. There's so many trade-offs, aren't there? And one of the things is, like a rich narrative. We were talking to Anna Stocky just about maths recently, and this whole thing of like algorithms and learning them to some fluency, and then from that some deeper conceptual understanding can emerge, rather than the other way around. And I'm thinking of talking to history teachers about, say, a broad view of, say, an event or a period can be more important than any one specific fact in it, but you need the facts to make sense of the broader narrative. So all these things are sort of complex. And this relates a little bit to what you've written about with deep knowledge and shallow knowledge. So, and I find that to me was a really nicely articulated thing. So can you, for people who haven't heard you explain that, what you talk about sort of deep knowledge being the goal, but shallow knowledge being kind of like the stepping stone. So, well, maybe I'm getting that wrong, but
no, I think that's exactly right. The distinction between shallow knowledge and deep knowledge is not that far from the distinction between knowing and understanding. When you know something, you can repeat it back and you can answer test questions, but your knowledge is, the usual term is brittle, being the opposite of flexible. You're not that great at describing it in your own words. You're not that great at sort of recognizing an idea that's really comparable, but it's, described in a different way, or it's concerns different content, different content, but the deep structure is the same. Sort of the relationships among the elements are the same. So sorry, Tom, I forgot I lost the thread of what you had asked.
Like you aim for the deep knowledge, but shallow.
Yeah, I mean, deep knowledge is really hard to get, right? I mean, of course you want deep knowledge, for goodness sakes, but it takes a long time to come to a deep understanding. I mean, I think I referenced a couple of studies about this in Why Don't Students Like School? There are wonderful studies of expertise in teaching, and every teacher recognizes expertise. You have deeper knowledge of the classroom, and so when they solve problems, it's in a more thoughtful, sort of more permanent solution. I think the classic study on this is how novice teachers versus experienced teachers deal with classroom disruptions. And novice teachers, it's kind of surface. They get rid of whatever the presenting problem is, and more experienced teachers are thinking about what caused this and what can I do to address the root cause of the problem. So for example, experienced teachers are much more ready to say, okay, you guys just can't sit together, right? Like an inexperienced teacher would say, now listen, 6 more times of doing that, and I'm going to have to get serious about this, right? So So anyway, yes, yeah, deep knowledge, of course, but it takes much longer. It's much harder won. All that is to say, shallow knowledge should not be denigrated. Shallow knowledge is much better than no knowledge at all. There are things you can do with shallow knowledge, the things you can do with isolated facts. Shallow knowledge is especially useful in the context of reading comprehension, because the main reason you need knowledge when you're reading is to replace from long-term memory information that the writer was confident that their audience had. And so if you're reading content that's for a general audience, the author didn't assume that you needed to know that much. So for example, if you're reading a technical, a book about 20th century art, they're going to assume that you know what Fauvism is, and they're going to assume you know all these names and movements and so on. And you're going to be, if you don't have that knowledge, you're going to be confused. You need deep knowledge in order to be able to read a technical work of art history. If, on the other hand, you're reading a newspaper, they're not going to assume you know all that, because it's written for a general audience. So they'll assume you know who Picasso is, but not who Picasso is beyond famous painter. If you got that kind of shallow knowledge, you're good. The key for reading content that's for a general audience is they think you know a lot of stuff. They just think you know it all at a very shallow level. So all of that is by way of saying, yes, of course, deep knowledge is desirable. Of course, that's what you want for your students. But you have to recognize you can't get deep knowledge of everything. They can't get deep knowledge of everything. And there's value in shallow knowledge as well.
That's a relief.
Yeah, right?
No, that's good to know, right? Because
yeah, saw my life flash before my eyes for a moment there.
So knowing a few, I mean, it's things like, capital cities and like just general information like that kind of level. It's helpful. And sometimes that gets denigrated, and sometimes people talk about it's too shallow. Everyone's always looking for the deep. And you also talk about drill and learning stuff for fluency. And of course, that can have a bad reputation. I always think if you call it drill or rote learning, it's bad. But if you just call it practice, no one seems to mind. But it's kind of,
well, they mind less. Yeah,
they mind less.
I think they're on to you though, Tom. I think in many cases.
But
Just
repetition is that,
call it rote like. So
Yeah.
just go down the Alphabet route and call it rote like learning rather than rote learning.
Oh my.
Rote learning, yeah.
Rote like learning.
That sounds almost worse, Emma, because that sounds like it's rote, but like I'm not even promising you're going to get out of it what you would get out of rote learning. I'm not promising it's rote. It's sort of rote like, okay, like
yeah.
It's a tribute act.
Yeah,
if you're going to go to it for rote, just go all in.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, exactly.
Commit to the rote.
Another of the trade-offs, though, is this sort of thing of coverage and time for consolidation and repetition.
Yes,
I feel like that's something which the role of practice generally,
and practice to the point of automaticity is really hard on everybody. It's hard on the students because it is boring. They feel like, gosh, I already know this. I mean, adults don't like practicing stuff they feel like they already know either. And it's hard on the teacher exactly because it's hard on the students. And you're trying to think of new tricks and new ways of doing this so it doesn't seem exactly the same. So, you do want to recognize that we are all paying a cost here, and you want to be selective. There's a lot of content that you don't need to learn to the point of automaticity. There's some that you really do. And so you want to, whatever the right idiom is, keep your powder dry or whatever it is, for moments it really matters.
And yeah, I mean, it's hard to get it all right. So something else I'm really interested in, and this is I'm going to switch gear and hold up this. It takes a lot of effort to hold it up. The Cognition 5th edition, and I think it's really new. So just before I ask you a question specifically about it, what's the status of this book? Is this like a book for students in college, or?
It is, yeah. That's it. So that's a textbook. If you were to take, an introduction to cognitive psychology course in college, that's a textbook you might use.
Okay, so that's interesting. So the question I have about it is, it links to some ideas that we discussed previously when we spoke to Ephrat first about the idea of encoding as a sort of learning pathway, as a sort of part of a learning process, which later then you can think about retrieval practice and strengthening connections. But this idea of encoding, and I've seen that challenged a little bit on social media, where people are saying, well, why do we have to use this word? Isn't it just learning? So I'm interested in, you've got a whole chapter on, or section on it. So what is encoding in your view as the professional here?
So yeah, I mean, encoding is whatever mental activity you are doing at a moment where you might be learning. So in other words, you can encode things, but they don't really stick with you. Learning hasn't really taken place. So encoding is just sort of the mental, it's basically whatever's happening in working memory. It's whatever sort of mental activity there is. You may be, encoding is also refers to sort of, if I try and deploy some strategy for the purpose of learning, we would refer to that as encoding. But even if I'm not doing it purposefully, and it's just because of the circumstances, I'm thinking about the content this way. I'm in a zoo and there's a lion there and it's roaring and so on. And so that's what I'm encoding. I'm really thinking about the sound of that lion and what it's doing and why perhaps then that's all an encoding episode. The reason to distinguish between encoding and learning, one thing is, as I just said, you can have encoding without learning. So it invites the question, what type of encoding makes it more probable that learning is going to happen? Right? That's one reason to distinguish between encoding and learning. The other is learning is usually assessed later, right? After not only encoding has happened, but stuff has sort of stayed in your long-term memory. It's been lying there for a while. And then there are processes of retrieval that you are using to try to coax this memory out. And so you've got encoding, storage, and retrieval, and different factors can affect different ones of those stages, right? Things we do behave, like sleep might have an impact on storage, doesn't really matter for retrieval. That turns out to be mostly true. Even if you're sleep deprived, retrieval doesn't care that much. Storage cares a whole lot, right? So if you're a memory researcher, this distinction is absolutely fundamental because you're interested in the processes. But even if you're a teacher, if you're kind of interested in cognition and how it might apply in the classroom, this is potentially useful vocabulary. These aren't terms that I use in most of my writing because I'm a believer that technical, asking people to follow you through technical vocabulary probably costs more than it gains.
But I find it useful because when I watch lessons, this is a thing I think where teachers, we all have this challenge, is that you imagine that your explanation as you're doing it, a typical flow, which is perhaps not efficient, is you explain, and then the students sort of maybe are asked to practice, and if they're struggling, and you ask them later to remember what we did, their encoding was the issue, but they never really learnt it. So you're sort of saying they're trying to remember something which isn't actually there, and because the task they didn't succeed in them all making sense, that meaning making aspect. So, and I'm interested in how, I don't know, how reluctant teachers are to go back to concrete things and very sort of hands-on. So how important is it that learning starts in a sort of concrete experiential mode? I suppose it depends on the topic but or can we just learn a lot just sort of in abstract through listening?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually lots of research on this, and it's mostly with smaller children, and the question is manipulatables. I'm gonna have a hard time saying that. I can't say Arnold Palmer either. I have to really focus to say Arnold Palmer. I don't know why. Things that one can manipulate is the way it's been examined. And it's actually a little bit of a mixed bag about whether or not it helps or not. And the reason is like pretty straightforward. Manipulables draw attention to something. If they draw attention to a feature that is a really good analog, really analogous to whatever it is you're trying to get them to understand, then it can help. If it doesn't, then it may simply distract them. They're now thinking about something. This is, again, memory is the residue of thought, right? They're now thinking about something else. I mean, the extreme would be, I'm teaching, a lesson in math and it's addition or something, and I'm using these really attractive stickers, and the kids are just like playing with the stickers, right? And it's sort of self-evident. I've given them something concrete and it's not working. Why? Well, because they're paying attention to something I didn't really want them to pay attention to. They're paying attention to the stickers, but not the right aspect of the stickers, right? And so that generally carries through. What you want is for students to pay attention to something that they already understand that's a useful stepping stone to where you want them to get. A lot of times that may be something concrete. It doesn't have to be something that they're holding in their hands or that they can see. It might be something that they have a visual image of, it's just something that they're familiar with. The reason I say that'll often be something concrete is that we understand many more things that are concrete than things that are abstract, because abstractions are difficult. But I think that's the key. When manipulables work, they work because you're coaxing out of the student something that you want them to think about. The manipulable guides their thinking. It sort of makes it unavoidable to think about, for example, length and diameter or whatever the property is. And that was, where you wanted them, because then the next thing you're going to say is, look, that's very similar to this idea, which is unfamiliar to you. Let's go on that journey now.
Right, okay, so that makes sense. So you have to really be clear about what those concrete things are.
That is a very important message, is that a lot of times, and I'm pretty sure there's empirical evidence on this. I'm going to say it anyway, but take it with a grain of salt. I'm pretty sure there's empirical data that, yeah, this all works much better if you direct the student's attention to what it is you want them to get out of it, as you're sort of introducing the material to them. The temptation, of course, is like, no, I want them to fiddle with it. I want them to explore. I want them to, right? And that is, of course, exciting and fun. But then unless that manipulable is very cunningly designed so that basically there's not that many things they can do with it, they're going to end up where you want them to end up anyway. If there's lots of ways it can go, then most of them are going to go off into little cul-de-sacs and blind alleys that aren't that productive. And then you're going to have to try and reel them back in.
This is really interesting, because when we teach early maths, the manipulatives that we use with the youngest children tend to be the ones that work best, are the ones that are the most surface level, boring.
Yeah.
But they really represent that concept really well. And the ones that are really powerful are the ones where you can teach it to demonstrate one concept, but then also use it to teach another concept that's related. So the manipulative itself acts as a bridge between understanding one concept and its link to the second concept. But a bit like with the stickers thing that you mentioned, and I go around it drives me mad when I work with people and that, but we used concrete apparatus. I'm like, yeah, but you used sticks on Monday, kites on Tuesday, giraffes on Thursday, elephants on, whatever day it was. And the children can't see either the generalizable rule from the first concept, And neither does it help them to bridge their thinking through to the next one you're going to teach, where not only are they learning the second concept, but they're remembering from the manipulative self, because that's acting as a reminder, what they learned from the first one. So when there's kind of grades of usefulness of manipulatives in the class. There's the really clunky way of doing it, and the not well thought through way, and then there's the really precise orientation of children's thinking towards the object and the concepts it demonstrates and the subsequent concepts you can highlight with it. Am I right there? Am I gone on down a rambling path?
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. And I think the genius example of that is Singapore math, right? And you know, to be clear, this is really, really vital when you're not just using a manipulative for, you know, it's a one-off. It's like, today we're going to study this. And you're talking about where ideas are connected, and they very frequently are. And so Singapore math, you know, the very youngest children start with concrete objects, and then they bridge them to stickers. And then the stickers become abstract little boxes. And the little boxes really are the number line. And you're going to see those little box models all the way, everything through algebra. And so they keep coming back to the same model, the same metaphor. It's a metaphor of space for numerosity. And children can understand space. They come to school understanding space in a way. They understand number, but they don't understand number the right way. And so you have to get them to understand a different version of number.
Sorry, Tom, you go.
Well, no, I just think it's so across different subjects, you know, just recognizing, you know, the patterns but I'm interested in this thing of, I mean, what you said there about starting with something that's familiar and trying to bridge to something conceptual. So, for example, I always think of a science demonstration where you have a copper carbonate, and you heat it up, and it's green, and it's like, to the children who doesn't know what it is, it's a green powder. That's all they're seeing, and you heat it up, and it turns to copper oxide and carbon dioxide, which escapes. So it turns black. Copper oxide is black. Now, a lot of kids' schema for things going black is that you've burnt it, like it's been combustion. So they're thinking, oh, it's been burnt, and thinking, no, it hasn't. But they don't really understand that. So they're just thinking at this macro level. So one type of powder changes color, and you're thinking it's a proof of thermal decomposition, and they're trying to relate it to this chemical equation.
Yeah.
So the work you have to do as a teacher to say that that's what it looks like, but this is what's happened. You have to have this then a model of molecules and atoms to make some visual sense. And actually, it's that abstraction of the molecular diagram which kind of makes sense of it. The macro visual thing actually is confusing. And it's that type of knowledge as a teacher you have to have. What's going to bridge to an understanding of what's happened?
And you know, and I don't know any chemistry at all, so forgive me if this is naive or stupid. But my first thought would be, I want to teach them why toast looks black when it's burnt, and why wood looks black when it's burnt, and get to the idea, bridge to the idea. Not everything has to burn to become black, and not everything that is burnt is black, right?
Yeah.
That, you know, get to the, you know, this is not what you're thinking of as kind of an ineffable part of the process. Really isn't. Let me show you how this actually does work.
Yeah, and it's then you have to have a level of visualization of it, which isn't the actual real world visualization, and that's true of a lot of sort of diagrams and so on. You sort of simplifying. It just shows you how fascinating, how complex it is. Another thing I wanted to ask you is about, as a scientist, is how you go about studying these things. So I know you mentioned that you're looking at, say, critical thinking, for example. And that's one of the things you've talked about a lot of times, is whether or not it's domain specific, and that's a hot debate, or whether you can teach critical thinking. There used to be even an exam in England called critical thinking as an exam. How do you go about studying that? How do you work out whether critical thinking can be transferable? What is there a kind of design process there that's well trodden, or do you have to design ever new experiments to explore that?
Yeah, no, I mean, people have been interested in this, for as long as anyone's been doing experimental psychology. And in fact, one of the first sort of big wins for educational psychology was on this very question, because in many American schools, children were learning Latin, and it was well understood this was of some use because there are Latinate words in many languages and so on. But it was a dead language, and the argument was more that this teaches critical thinking, and it teaches critical thinking because the grammar of Latin is so logical and orderly, and so learning Latin makes that orderly, logical thinking habitual, and so you become more logical in your thinking in other subjects. So how do you test that, to your question? Well, what Edward Thorndike did was to find students who were comparable in other ways, but for one reason or another, some of them were taking Latin, others were taking a different foreign language. And then he looked, after you've studied Latin, are your grades better than someone who started at the same place, but they were studying French? And what he found was, no, those kids weren't doing any better in Latin. And that study, and others liked it, seemed to indicate that transfer is very, very difficult, and that the procedures that you learn to cope with a logical form or a particular type of problem tend to stick with the format in which you originally learned it.
So what would you say to teachers? Because these things still persist. I mean, there are some schools where they literally have critical thinking lessons, and and I remember one critical thinking exam. It was like an English A-level exam, and it was about this was like whether or not if you had a beach an ice cream stall on a beach, and there was one already there, and you wanted to also sell ice creams in competition with those people, would you be better off putting it next to the existing one or further down the beach? I was thinking, how does anyone approach this? It's like, I know nothing about this, but this is part of a critical thinking assessment. And I was thinking that people who study economics and business would know about this and would be able to just like go, well, that's why there is always
right
a whole string of shops the same, because actually it turns out that putting them together is better for some reason. But someone who
my guess, so I have lots of thoughts on this, Tom. So here's this is very typical. So if you look at measures of critical thinking, you're not going to find problems of chemistry or deep economics or anything. They're aware of the fact that you need content knowledge to think critically, and some kids may not know chemistry, they may not know economics. So they try and pose problems like that they think are more sort of everyday problems. So like a very typical one would be, here's some instructions for a new piece of software. See if you can work out how to get it to do thus and so. Or, here's a problem that's framed in terms of a social situation at school. So they're trying to minimize the role of content knowledge. You're not really removing knowledge from critical thinking. What you're doing is you're trying to make it as broad as possible. Exactly the same thing is done in reading tests. People who design reading tests are aware of the fact that comprehension depends on background knowledge. So they try to make the passages about ants and about mountains and stuff that they figure most people know about. There's more research on this in the case of reading than there is in critical thinking, but I think the situation is probably the same. What you're doing is you're people who have more broad knowledge score better on reading comprehension tests than people who don't have very much knowledge. That tends to correlate with income. kids who grow up in environments where there are lots of learning opportunities know more stuff than kids who grow up in circumstances where there are fewer learning opportunities. Again, my guess is knowledge is playing the same role in these critical thinking tests, and you're probably getting similar sorts of effects. The way around that is to, instead of saying, I'm trying to test critical thinking, broadly speaking, is to write a test that's tied to the curriculum. All right, the kids studied whales this year, and the kids studied inductive reasoning. We're going to test inductive reasoning in the context of knowledge about whales, right? And if I were a teacher, I would feel a whole lot better about a test like that. I know that the content and the thinking skills that I'm trying to help my children understand are exactly what the assessment is going to prize.
That makes sense. It sounds like you made it sound so obvious, and yet. I mean, Emma, what's your experience of critical thinking?
It's obvious if you have a good understanding of how critical thinking works. If you think of critical thinking as this sort of free-floating skill that once you've acquired it can be applied to any knowledge, then it's less obvious.
Yeah.
I've got a kind of slight change of tack, Tom, if I'm allowed to go down there.
Go for it. Yeah, we haven't got much longer. Go for it.
I was going to ask about, so I don't think you could walk more than 6 paces in a school in the UK now without finding a copy of Why Don't Students Like School, Dan? It's sort of it's a bit like you find a Bible in a drawer in a hotel room. You will find a copy of your book in schools everywhere.
I love that, Emma. Yeah, and like the Bible, I think everyone should study a few verses of my book every day.
But my question is, it was written a little while ago. There's been lots and lots of changes in the world and in education. Is there, and we've got lots of challenges at the moment, especially in the UK, with attendance, with children wanting to come to school, with the attitudes of parents and families about the role of school. And I was just thinking, what are your thoughts on why don't students like school now? And are they the same as when you wrote that book, or are there like additional chapters that you'd like to put in, or anything that you'd like to kind of caveat?
So I think I know to what you're referring, that in terms of what's changed there, and you tell me whether this is true in the UK. In the US, there have been huge changes post-pandemic, in particular, in terms of student motivation, student stamina. So, surveys of teachers say students are just not the same compared to the way they were pre-pandemic. They don't seem to have stamina is the word that's used most frequently. They don't just say, I didn't do the reading. They say, I can't read anything that long, and they can't focus in class and so on. Is that what you were alluding to? Yeah.
Very, very similar. And the kind of, is there anything about the other part is about the teaching? Because what I'm finding as well is that there's lots of teachers who are teaching now who've never taught pre-pandemic as well. And because teaching had to happen in a very specific way during the pandemic, then are there aspects of pedagogy or approaches to teaching that may have been inadvertently eroded, lost, changed along the way as well? So it's kind of the two things. It's the changes in the students, and then the potential disruption to the development of teaching approaches during that period as well.
So the short answer is I'm unsure, obviously. I mean, there are not good data on this. My sense, in talking to American teachers, my sense is we, for very good reasons, expected less of children during the pandemic. deadlines were very, very flexible or meaningless. We assigned less, just across the board, and that made sense. Everybody was under enormous stress. The teaching was happening in non-optimal ways. Everyone was making it up as they went. And American teachers tell me we haven't really gotten back to where we were. The reason I'm less confident that that's fully a thing is I hear the same thing from Australian educators. And in Australia, they did not shut down the way we did. And so I think there wasn't the same sort of relaxation of standards that we saw. And again, all of this is anecdotal, so I don't really know. But my friends in Australia say, like, we're seeing the same thing in our classrooms in terms of students having, big problems with motivation and attention and so on. So I'm unsure of which way to go. If the problem were primarily we need to get back to where we were, I would feel more confident that we would know how to do that. If that's not the issue, then I'm unsure of what the problem is and therefore what to do about it.
It's fascinating to hear it's a world issue, because it's very easy to see what's happening in your locality and in your own kind of home nation.
Yes.
But to hear how it's being echoed and played out in systems worldwide is really, really interesting. So thank you.
And I'd love to hear what you all are seeing.
Well, I tell you what's happening in Australia is they're having the same like big debates around the maths pedagogy and reading and the formality of that instruction and the kind of direct instruction, instructional approaches to reading and maths.
Yes,
is a big debate, and like it has been in the US and in England. I think we've sort of debate was a few years back because it kind of was just like just we're getting on with it. We weren't really allowed to have the debate anymore. But it's sort of I think that's definitely a commonality. And I mean you've done some really interesting. I saw you do a fantastic talk about the effect of reading with devices and so on. And one of the fascinating conclusions that, well, as I remember from the data, was that we can't really say children are reading less because they were never reading that much in the first place.
Yeah.
And so it's not some sort of halcyon days of like teenagers, lapping up novels that we're kind of no longer enjoying, and maybe they're reading on their phones and all the rest of it. So in other words, they're encountering text in newer forms. So I find these things are interesting. There's no real answers. Anyway, look, we're getting the big red light flash from our producer Luke saying our time's nearly up. So honestly, we could probably just do a whole nother hour. There's so many things to talk about, and I think as Emma alluded to just there about the book, the influence you've had is very profound, and I feel like it's I don't know if you wear that sort of heavily, like you're aware of that, but your name comes up constantly. I don't know if you feel that sort of you've lost control of your own words because people are interpreting them around the place, but you must feel good about that.
Well, I did until you just said that.
No, but it's true. I mean, as Willingham says, it's sort of
yeah, and then and I'm of course very grateful. You write a book, you hope for the best, and the reception to that book in particular has been much warmer than I could have hoped. But it is a little bit of a standing joke with me that, like, after I give a talk on something sort of cognitive-y, the most common response is a teacher will come up to me and say, I love that because it really affirms what we do at my school. And then what comes out of their mouth next could be anything. This could be a teacher from a military academy or a Waldorf school or, just anything. Because there is a little bit of a process of sort of hearing and seeing what you want in any message, right? So yeah, I'm sorry, I just had that memory when you said that there, sometimes things are open to very liberal interpretation, and I've seen that, but overall, yeah, thrilled that people are interpreting it all.
as a unifying thing. So I think people, you're trusted by many people because you're not a divisive person. You're just understanding of people's challenges, and I think there is a universality to that. You sort of understand the teachers' experience, children's experience, and that comes through. So I'm going to say a huge thank you. It's a real honor to have you on the podcast.
Well, real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I've been following your work since your rainforest book with great attention and pleasure. And so getting a chance to do a little collaboration on something is really exciting for me.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say that. So look, thank you so much to Dan Willingham for being on our show. It's great to have you. Thank you to everyone listening to Mind the Gap. We're always honoured by how many people listen in Australia, the US, Canada, and other places. We have a broad audience, and we're in a flow of some really great guests. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you again on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to Mind the Gap. I'm Emma Turner, and I've been presenting with my co-host Tom Sherrington. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, share on social media, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on our YouTube channel, search for Mind the Gap with Tom and Emma, or head over to Spotify for an audio version. This podcast was produced in association with Haringey Education Partnership, and our producer for today's episode was Luke Kemper.